this is Mr. Coates, and this is AP Environmental Science Lecture number 10 on biodiversity and evolution. All right, first of all, I want to get a little history out of the way. So let's talk about this gentleman up here. This is George Buffon, and he was French, and he was a geologist. And before his time, basically, most of the belief when it came to biology was based on religious teachings. And so the religious teachings said that the Earth was only about 10,000 years old. Well, Buffon, he came about and he started studying fossils. He was a geologist or a paleontologist, and he started studying fossils, and he was one of the first scientists to ever postulate that the Earth might be older than 10,000 years based on his evidence from fossils. Now, of course, this probably really didn't go over well in the religious community, and he was probably shunned for it. The next scientist I want to talk about is this guy over here. His name is Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Now, Lamarck was an interesting fellow as well. Lamarck basically was one of the first scientists to look at organisms and say, hey, organisms have changed over time. And once again, this was a huge problem for religion because all the religious teachings said that species had been created and they had not changed since time of creation. Well, Lamarck was the first one to say that species changed over time. And although his reasons of how and why species changed were pretty much incorrect, he was the first one to say species changed. So this brings us down to these two gentlemen down here. This one down here is Darwin, of course, and this one down here is Alfred Wallace. Now, both these were Englishmen. Darwin was basically a young boy in England in the 18 teens. And he spent a lot of time outside, and he was a very good observer, and he took a lot of drawings of nature, and he basically just made a lot of observations. Charles was fairly well educated, and most ship captains at this time were fairly well educated as well. And so a ship captain always wanted someone highly educated with them on the voyage so they could converse, spend time either playing music or talking about philosophy or whatever while the boat was underway. Darwin thought this was a great idea, and so Darwin also accepted. He wanted to go out and see the world. So this was in the 1830s at this time. So they took a trip and they went around the south end of South America, and they went up to the Galapagos Islands, obviously. They spent time in both areas, both South America and the Galapagos. And during this time, Darwin made all kinds of new observations. Remember, he'd only been in England prior to this, and so all of his observations he compared to what he saw in England. And he wrote all these things down. He collected many biological specimens and sent them back to England, and basically started thinking about ways that species might change based on what he saw. Now, at the same time, this other guy, Alfred Wallace here, was working in Indonesia. And he was also starting to come up with very similar ideas to Darwin. In fact, he even wrote Darwin. He knew about Darwin. He knew that Darwin had published several different scientific manuscripts and knew about Darwin. And so he wrote Darwin about his idea, which is very similar to Darwin's idea of natural selection, and wanted to know Darwin's thought about it, and panicked Darwin into producing his book called On the Origin of Species. Darwin said that, hey, other people are starting to have these same ideas as me. I better get my ideas out there. Now, once again, these ideas were rather new and rather controversial. But Darwin stuck to his guns. He had lots of scientific evidence that supported him, and he wrote the book, On the Origin of Species. Wallace later on read the book. He was enamored with Darwin. He appreciated the book. He never felt bad towards Darwin for publishing the ideas first. And they were good friends for quite a long time. And ever since this time, man has been looking and collecting evidence on the theory of evolution. And so let's get into what the theory is all about. So as I said, on Darwin's travels, he went to the Galapagos Islands, and he saw forms of life he'd never seen before. The iguana here is the marine iguana of the Galapagos. It's the only iguana in the world that actually swims underwater. The males do this. However, they're very similar to the iguanas found on the mainland of South America, and he saw those when he went as well. This, a red-footed booby here. This one also only found in Galapagos along with the blue-footed booby, which is down here. There's also a flightless cormorant, and then, of course, the giant tortoises. So all these animals were very specific to the Galapagos Islands. So what Darwin inferred is that animals that lived in South America, here off Ecuador and Colombia and Peru down here, they somehow got on rafts of vegetation, probably due to some kind of major flooding that occurred, and they would flow out these rivers, and they would float on the oceanic currents. Maybe it was some animals from Panama, and eventually they would float all the way over here to the Galapagos Islands and come off their rafts of vegetation. Well, the Galapagos Islands habitat is much different than the habitat you find over here. It's drier, it's rockier. There was enough things there to support animals. However, over time, some animals developed adaptations that helped them survive better. Actually, those that survived better had adaptations that helped them survive. And so we started getting different forms of similar animals, like this marine iguana here. All right, so let's talk about the word adaptation. This word is always misunderstood when it comes to biology. A lot of people think that adaptation means being able to change yourself to a certain situation. And yeah, that might be the root word, but in biology it means something different. Biology is a physical trait that you are born with. So it's all inherited. When we talk about adaptation in science, we're talking about an inherited variation. It could be blue eyes, it could be extra long fingers, it could be height over 7 feet. These are all adaptations. And so what he started looking at was that certain tortoises, and he looked at finches as well, but certain tortoises had different neck lengths, they had different shell sizes and shapes, and he started looking at their environment, and he saw that the ones with the really long necks ate really high up, whereas the ones with the short necks only ate grasses, and their island had mostly grasses, whereas the island where this one came from, on Hood Island down here, didn't have any grasses. All the bushes were pretty tall. And so he started looking at this and saying, is the environment actually driving the change in neck length here? And that's what we mean by adaptation. Those animals that have longer necks, maybe a fraction of an inch longer, would survive better over a longer period of time. And as you have more and more variation in the population, the longer the neck, the better off they were, and they reproduced. So there are two main points that Darwin came up with in his theory. Okay, the first one is that species living on Earth today are descended from ancestral species. Now, this was a huge jump in what we knew about life on the planet. And once again, this was highly controversial in the entire world at that point. He called this descent with modification. So what this means is that we have an ancestor. So we're going to look at just horses here. Okay, and we have an ancestor of the horse. And so this ancestor here, over time, and because of environmental differences and variations in the population of horses, started branching out into several species. So we have this species here, and this species here. And if you look, they're not that much different. Some of them have stripes. Some of their skeletons are a little different. Legs are a little bit longer. This one has shorter legs. This one's very long legs. And so what happens is that in the fossil record, we start to see differences in horse species. So we get all up to today's present-day horses, which are a little bit bigger than previous horses. And so all these changes over time is what we call evolution. And these changes come about because these changes are selected for in the environment. And I'll get to more of that in a minute. Now, this descent with modification really accounts for the biodiversity on the planet. So let's look at adaptation. As we said earlier, adaptations are inherited. That much means you must be born with them in order to have them. You can't gain an adaptation through your lifetime. If you're not adapted to your environment, chances are you're going to die. That's just the way it is. That's the harsh reality of natural selection. But if you have the adaptations to survive, even if changes occur, then you're going to survive and reproduce and pass on those traits that allow your offspring to survive. So let's look at this picture down here. This octopus, and if you don't see it, it's right here, is highly adapted to the environment where it came from. Look at how well it blends in with the rocks here. So it has the adaptation to camouflage itself so it can hunt and be an ambush predator. It can also flash these camouflage patterns on and off, so it can signal other octopi, and it has the ability, and if you look right here, it's doing it a little bit, to change the texture of its skin. So octopi are very good at mimicking nature. And so they have this adaptation that helps them survive. Now, if you have an octopus that doesn't have this adaptation or doesn't do it very well, there's a good chance that octopus is going to get picked off by some predator and not survive to reproduce. So let's look at natural selection. Organisms that have traits that help them survive in the environment, that means that they have adaptations that help them survive in the environment, survive long enough to reproduce and pass on those adaptations. In this case, we want to look at it, what decides what lives and what dies is nature. This is why I called it natural selection. Nature does the selecting. The individual organism has no say-so in the matter, whether they either have the adaptation or they don't. And if they don't, it's tough luck. So that's what we mean by natural selection. Let's look at populations of mice. These are different populations of beach mouse found here in the southeast United States. And so we have two different populations here in Florida. There's another one here, another one, actually several in Florida here. And if we look at their coat colors, these are all related genetically. However, they're different populations in different species. But they are just a little different in their coat color. If we look, there's some that are dark, some are very bright. Okay? And what they found out is that the ones that are dark are mostly found inland. In these areas where there's woods and other brown coverings. Those that are light in color, like this one here, are found where there's lots of sand. And then you have another group over here that are also light, where there's also lots of sand on the beach. And they blend in well with the sand. Realize this population is genetically dissimilar to this one. And then there's this one in between, which is closely related to this population. And the reasons why they have different coats is because that's what color has been selected for. So there are natural variations. So we start down here with the ancestor. The ancestor had natural variations of dark and light colors. If you lived in this habitat, the variation of light color was selected for. If you lived in this habitat, the variation of dark was selected for. This allowed different populations and almost different species now to appear. And this is what natural selection is all about. Once again, nature decides, not the organism. The mice could not change their color. This all goes back to variations. I mentioned that there are variations in populations. These are natural variations based on DNA changes, DNA mutations per se. Any change in a DNA sequence is called a mutation. And mutations allow for different forms of the same organism to show up. For example, there was a mutation in this caterpillar that allowed for these spots to appear. These spots look like a face. And so organisms or caterpillars that had this mutation probably survived better and passed this mutation on than ones without. Same thing goes with the snakes here when we talk about mimicry. What happened is that this one here, this is the coral snake. This one is venomous. Red on yellow, kill a fellow, right? This one here happens to be the king snake, scarlet king snake. Now this one probably had some variation in its population that made it similar to what this looked like. Predators know this one's venomous, they avoid it, and so this one with the proper coloration that was very similar to the venomous one is the group that survived the best. They had the best variation. This one over here probably didn't survive as well because the variation wasn't as close to the coral snake as this one is. So variations can be all kinds of things like mimicry, like this frog down here that looks like its surroundings, to something that looks like giant eye spots. All right, so let's look at some evidence that support evolutionary theory. Fossil record is the biggest one. Fossil record, this is a trilobite. Okay, a trilobite was an ancient form of crab. And you can see how it can be related to crab. It's got an armor-type skeleton. It has a segmented body, and underneath it had segmented legs, which is very much like today's crabs and insects. And so by looking at the fossil record, we can tell what organisms came in what order for the most part. And usually this happens because the deeper it's buried in the earth means the older it is. And so we call that relative dating. This organism here shows some of the adaptations that today's modern ancestors have, but we don't have this animal anymore on the planet. We have some similar ones like the horseshoe crab, but not quite the same. And so you can kind of see how over time mutations and through natural selection, the horseshoe crab might have become about because of minor changes in DNA. Another thing we can look at is comparative anatomy. If we look at the arms or flippers or wings of mammals, for example, and we look at the bone structure, we see that there's one bone here, there's two bones here, there's a whole bunch of bones in the wrist joints, and then there's finger bones. And if we were to count all these bones throughout all these appendages for these different mammals, we would find that there are the same amount of bones. Even a whale has fingers in its flippers. It's not just one big bone, it has fingers here. And so by looking at comparative anatomy, we can say that maybe at one time there was a common ancestor that was a mammal that had these same bone structures, and over time that ancestor branched out into these different forms. And it probably went several different branches in there, but you get the point. So there's a common ancestor up here, and they branched out into these different forms over long periods of time, and this is all based on selection. Now, with the advent of being able to look at DNA and also the structure of proteins and other molecules, we are starting to link evolutionary relationships using macromolecules or using microbiology. If we look here, and this is an amino acid chain or a protein chain for hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is the substance in your blood, the protein in your blood that carries the oxygen molecule. And so it is made up of 146 amino acids. Remember, amino acids are the building blocks for proteins. And if we take the 146 amino acids and we look at them, remember there's 20 different amino acids that organisms have in them. So if we take humans and we look at what their sequence of amino acids is for hemoglobin, and we look at gorillas, you see here that gorillas have one sequence, which means probably one DNA mutation here that separates their hemoglobin from our hemoglobin. They're almost exactly the same except for one minor amino acid, which might be the result of one mutation in the DNA. We get further down into the older world monkeys here, and we start to get more changes. So in this case, 8 amino acids are changed here. So this might correspond to maybe 10, 12, 16, 20 some different DNA mutations here. We get further down the mammal line and we start getting in mice 27 differences in that amino acid chain. And then finally we get to chickens, which aren't mammals at all. We start to see there are 45 differences, and then amphibians have 67 differences in that hemoglobin chain. This means that most of the DNA is different by the time we get down here. However, when we talk about mammals, this group right here, the DNA is relatively similar. And so we can look at all kinds of different proteins and find those similarities. Now, how does evolution relate to biodiversity? If we look at evolution over the amounts of time that we have had life on the planet, and we start way down the back of the beginning, there was some kind of common ancestor at the very beginning. Nobody knows what it was. Maybe it was a bacteria. It had to be something very simple, though, not something complex. As time went on, conditions on the planet changed, and new structures and new variations in this population started coming about. And so you started getting these branches in those populations. And so over time, we started seeing all these new things, these new structures. In fact, fins becoming feet or legs. Things that were mostly aquatic, like this, start becoming land-based, whereas this line stays aquatic, so forth. Okay, and then finally we start getting to our modern-day amphibians. And we're talking long periods of time. We're talking millions of years for this to occur. And so it's all based on natural selection. And if we were to go back any farther, we would see that this branch is off here, and this probably branches off here, and this branches off here, and these branch, and these branch. And you get so many branches, you get this huge tree of life. And all these different organisms that we see nowadays at the top here is our biodiversity. And it's come about because of all these changes due to natural selection and random mutation. So that's where evolution and biodiversity are related. All right, so here are some comprehensive questions. You need to answer these questions. You can go back to your notes, you can rewind the video and so forth and answer these questions. Answer them with full sentences, be thorough, be an AP student, and bring these to class, and we'll talk about your answers in a small group. And remember, also have a separate question that you just didn't understand about the notes. All right? I hope this was helpful.